Okay, philosophers, in this video, I want to introduce you to some basic concepts of logic and argumentation. Specifically, we're going to talk about deductive arguments and the concepts of validity and soundness. Now, when we talk about an argument in logic class, we're not talking about a conflict between two people. Instead, we're talking about a group of statements in which one or more statements, which we call premises, are supposed to provide supporting evidence for another statement, which is called the conclusion. So let me give you a couple examples here. Look at this first argument. In this first argument, the first premise says all men are mortal. The second premise says Socrates is a man. And then there's a conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, this kind of argument is called a deductive argument. And in this argument, if those two premises are true, if it's really true that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man, then it must necessarily be the case that Socrates is mortal. There's also another kind of argument called an inductive argument, like the second one here. And here we have one premise and one conclusion. The premise says, all the swans that I've ever seen have been white. And the conclusion is, therefore, all swans are white. That's called an inductive argument. And it doesn't necessitate the truth of its conclusion. Even if the premise is true, it simply makes the conclusion very likely. They're both fine kinds of arguments in their place. They just come with different degrees of evidential power. Now, I've said that arguments are composed of statements. What is a statement? Well, a statement is a sentence that has a truth value. That is, it's a sentence which is either true or false. Now, not every sentence has a truth value. So questions and commands and exclamations, those are different kinds of sentences which are neither true nor false. So for example, if I say the cat is on the mat, that is either true or it's false. If the cat is on the mat, then the statement is true. And if it's not on the mat, then that sentence is false. The point is, the cat is on the mat is a statement. It's the right kind of sentence. It has a truth value. But if I ask a question, is the cat on the mat? Well, the question itself isn't true or false. The answer that you give to that question might be true or false, but not the question. It doesn't have a truth value. It's not a statement. And therefore, that is not the kind of sentence which can ever appear in an argument. Similarly, look at the command. Look at that cat. Now, it can't be true that look at that cat, and it can't be false that look at that cat. Commands may be, good commands or bad commands. They may be reasonable or unreasonable, but they're not true or false. Therefore, they're not statements, and they're not the kind of sentence that can appear in an argument. Similarly, the exclamation, cats, or yum, cats, they're not making a statement. It can't be true that yum, cats. It can't be false either, so it can't appear in an argument. Statements are sentences that do have truth values. Logic is the discipline that studies the relationships between the premises and the conclusions of an argument. It's the discipline that studies whether an argument is a good argument or a bad argument, whether or not the premises really support the conclusion. Now, I've said before that there are at least two kinds of arguments that provide two different kinds of support to their conclusions. There's deductive arguments and inductive arguments. But in this unit, we are going to focus only on deductive arguments, the kind of arguments that necessitate the truth of their conclusion if they're well formed. So, a good kind of deductive argument, if it's logically correct, is going to be valid. So a valid deductive argument is an argument in which, assuming the premises are true, it is impossible for that conclusion to be false. In other words, the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. Now, I can't stress too much how important this definition is. You need to memorize this definition. I will test you on it. And not only do you need to memorize it, you need to understand it. You need to grasp this concept so that you can employ it in your discussions of arguments and how you evaluate them. Let me give you some examples of valid and invalid deductive arguments. So for example, here's an example of a valid one. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Sasser is a man. Therefore, conclusion, Sasser is mortal. Now, that argument is valid. If it's true that all men are mortal and Sasser is a man, then it must be true. It can't possibly be false that Sasser is going to live forever. I'm going to die. So that is logically valid. Now, in this particular example, the premises are in fact true. Like, it is true that all men are mortal. It is true that I'm a man, and therefore the conclusion also is true that I'm going to die. However, you can have a valid argument that has false premises and a false conclusion. For example, all unicorns eat pixie dust. Sasser is a unicorn. Therefore, Sasser eats pixie dust. Now, this is a logically correct, valid argument. Why? Because if the premises are true, assuming that they are true, just for a moment, it would necessarily follow that Sasser eats pixie dust. It couldn't possibly be false. It's true simply in virtue of the structure of that argument, which is the exact same structure as of the first argument. However, although this is a valid argument, it's not sound, and I'll talk about soundness in a little bit. My point here is that the validity of an argument does not depend upon the actual truth of the premises. What it depends upon is that if those premises were true, they necessitate the truth of the conclusion. Let me give you an example now of an argument in which all of the premises are true and the conclusion is true, but it's not a valid argument. Check this out. Premise 1, Greenville is in South Carolina. Dogs are mammals. Therefore, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Now, why is this not a valid argument? Because it's conceivable, it's possible that even if the premises were true, and in fact they are, that would still be consistent with Abraham Lincoln living to a ripe old age without being assassinated. In other words, the premises don't necessitate the truth of the conclusion. It happens to be true that Lincoln was assassinated, but those premises do not necessitate the truth of that conclusion. So this is not a logically valid argument. It's not logically correct. So if you're trying to figure out whether or not an argument is valid or not, one rough and ready test is this. Can you conceive of a world, any world, in which the premises are true and yet the conclusion turns out false? If that is even conceivable, then the argument is not valid. But if you can't conceive of the premises being true and the conclusion turning out false, then that is a valid argument. All right, let me say 3 key points about this concept of validity. First of all, as I just pointed out, validity is independent of the truth of the premises or the truth of the conclusion. Like we just saw, you can have a logically valid argument in which the premises are all false and the conclusion is false. And you can have a logically valid argument in which the premises, you can have a logically invalid argument in which all the statements are true. So validity is independent of the actual truth of the premises. What it has to do with is if the premises were true, would they necessitate the truth of the conclusion? Second point here, validity is a property of arguments, not of single statements. Now that's different than how we use this term in day-to-day life. People often say things like, oh, you've got a valid point, or you've got a valid perspective. In logic, a single point or perspective is not valid or invalid because validity has to do with the relationship between multiple statements. It has to do with whether one set of statements necessitates the truth of another statement. So it's not about just one single statement on its own. On the other hand, truth and falsehood, those are properties of single statements, but an argument can't be true or false. So you can't have a true argument. The conclusion of the argument may be true. The premise or premises of an argument may be true, but an argument per se is neither true nor false. So validity belongs only to arguments. It does not belong to single statements. Truth belongs only to single statements, but not to arguments. And then thirdly, third point here, validity does not come in degrees. You can't have a sort of valid argument or a mostly valid argument. Validity is all or nothing. Either the premises necessitate the conclusion or they don't, and there's no in between. All right, so that's the concept of validity. It has to do with the logical relationship between the statements and the premises and the conclusion. Now, one way that you can test an argument to figure out whether or not it's valid or not is, as I said, to try to conceive of a situation in which the premises of the argument are all true, but the conclusion is false. If you can conceive of such a situation, the argument is not valid. Let me give you an example of how to do this. Consider the following argument. Premise one, everyone who lives in Beaufort lives in South Carolina. Premise two, Al lives in South Carolina. Conclusion, therefore, Al lives in Beaufort. Okay, now let's run the test. See if you can conceive of a world in which it's true that everybody who lives in Beaufort lives in South Carolina. Assume that's true. Also assume that it's true that Al lives in South Carolina. Now, can you conceive of a situation in which those two things are both true, and yet it's false that Al lives in Beaufort, doesn't live in Beaufort? Is that conceivable? Think about it for a second. Yes, it is conceivable. Now describe the situation to me that you just conceived of. Here's what it is. You can conceive of Al living in Charleston. If Al lives in Charleston, then P1 and P2, those first two premises, those would still be true, but the conclusion would be false. So this is not a valid argument. Now, validity is not the only thing that we care about when it comes to evaluating deductive arguments. Validity describes the logical correctness of a deductive argument. And that's logical correctness is necessary, but is not sufficient to make an argument acceptable. A really good argument also has to have all true premises. Remember that valid argument that I made before. All unicorns eat pixie dust, Sasser is a unicorn, therefore Sasser eats pixie dust. That was logically valid, but you don't want to accept that argument because the premises aren't true. So what you want is an argument that is not only logically valid, but also has all true premises. And an argument that meets that criteria is called sound. And the conclusion of a sound argument is true. It's necessarily true. It must be true. That's the gold standard. The A+ of arguments is a sound argument. So that's your basic concepts here of validity and soundness, and we'll say more about those as we apply them to real arguments in future videos.